Hello everyone, my name is Denise and I'll be doing a review on this book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Okay, first up, who was Viktor Frankl? He was an Austrian psychiatrist who lived between 1905 to 1997. He's the founder of logotherapy and very famously, he was also a concentration camp survivor. He survived Auschwitz and there were many opportunities that he could have died, but he survived and managed to come out of the concentration camp alive and wrote this book. Okay, so this book is split into two parts. The first part talks about his experience in the concentration camp, and the second part just gives a brief about logotherapy. So before I begin, I'm just going to talk briefly about logotherapy. So logotherapy is parked under the existential therapies. So under existential therapies, which is something that's postmodern, it talks about your own personal definition of things. It could be personal definition of what you want your fate to be, what your values are. But in this case, logotherapy has a very strong component and emphasis on your own personal motivations, your own personal meaning. What are you living for? Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. Let's look at the introduction. So on the preface, it wrote here, so Frankl is fond of quoting Nietzsche's, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." So this is a quote that appears many times in this smaller book, and also you see interviews of him on YouTube. You'll see he keeps saying this: "He who has a why to live bears with almost anyhow." So I think that is also his motto, the kind of the quote that really got him through the hardships of the concentration camp was this: he fixated on the why to live, so he can bear the how. However dehumanizing or degrading it was for him, he survived it. Okay, there's another quote on page 9, preface, that I would love to read to all of you. "Hunger, humiliation, fear, and deep anger at injustice are rendered tolerable by closely guarded images of beloved persons, by religion, by a grim sense of humor, and even by glimpses of the healing beauties of nature, a tree or a sunset." So that, I think, beautifully summarizes the first part of this book. And but I will dive deeper to give you more solid examples of what he meant. Okay. Next up, let's take a look at page... Let me see. Okay, page 66. So page 66 talked about, because even though you are a prisoner in the Auschwitz concentration camp, you might be moved from one camp to another. And at that time, there was this, what's this word? This rule, this silent rule, that if you get too skinny, too weak to work, to do any hard labor, you'll be sent off to the gassing chambers, okay? But to drag people to the gas chambers, people usually don't want to. So they'll say, they'll do it under the guise, so I'm going to put you in a resting camp or this and that. So there was one day where Viktor Frankl was on a list of people to be transferred to a resting camp. And at that time, he was so sure that it is just a euphemism for gassing. So he actually gave his verbal will to his friends, and he was ready to just go off on that van to whatever his fate was, whether it's a concentration, another gassing chamber, or it's a resting camp. He's okay with that. And his friends tried to stop him from getting on that van. Said that we'll get your name off the list. He said, no, just do it. Let fate decide. I'm okay with that. So as it turns out, I'm going to read this. Okay. There was a shortage of food in the original camp, and cannibalism had broken out. I had left just in time. So indeed, he was going to a resting camp. It wasn't a euphemism for a gas chamber. He and his friends on that pickup truck, they went to a resting camp, and those who remained suffered greatly because whatever meager food they had was all gone, and they were so hungry that they resorted to cannibalism. So at this juncture, he shared this very interesting story That is a bit lengthy, it's a paragraph, but it's worthy of read because it's quite meaningful. Okay, I'm gonna read this out to you. Does this not bring to mind the story of death in Tehran? A rich and mighty Persian once walked in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried that he had just encountered death, who had threatened him. He begged his master to give him his fastest horse, so that he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met death and questioned him, "Why did you terrify and threaten my servant?" "I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here, and I plan to meet him tonight at Tehran," said Death. So this is a wonderful story. Like, in your attempt to escape fate, you're actually meeting your fate. So he said that using this logic, he just didn't escape fate. In fact, there was many opportunities for him to escape the camp. He did not. He just went with the flow because he believed that somehow, if it is fate to die, he will die. If it is fate to live, he will live. So that's fantastic. Okay, of course, what comes to mind is a more modern day mythology, which is Kung Fu Panda, first episode, right? The first movie about how Tai Lang was about to escape from the prison, and they sent a duck to warn the guards, this very highly secure prison. So the duck, in his haste to warn the prison guards, actually left one feather. The feather floated down and accidentally released Tai Lang. So in your attempt to avert fate, you might actually speed up fate. So just don't do anything. I think this is also very aligned to the Taoist philosophy, Wu Wei. Just don't do anything. Let nature take its course, and it will fix. A lot of problems can be fixed by itself if we ignore them. This is not denial. This is Wu Wei. Wu Wei. I think Wu Wei. Okay. Next up, let's take a look at. Okay, this is page 72. I'm going to read a short passage. Besides these physical causes, there were mental ones in the form of certain complexes. The majority of prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. We all had once been or had fancied ourselves to be somebody, and now we were treated like complete non-entities. Okay, in fact, a lot of the prisons in the camp, all of them, they were just given a number and referred to by their number. So in the earlier part of the book, it wrote they can change their names, change their profession, create an entirely different backstory if they wanted to. And some of them did, some of them didn't. Okay, anyway, all that they held on to in the past, maybe their certificates, their wealth, their professional status, their lineage and the family bloodline, all this just fade into non-being. They're just this very dehumanized prisoner now. So yes, indeed, there's a form of low self-esteem. Okay, when I think about that, it brings to mind a lot of what happens to you when you are severely bullied in school or at the workplace or anywhere. You also have the same kind of dehumanizing effect. So that can have an impact on one's self-esteem. Okay, next up, let's take a look at page 82. So one of the techniques that Viktor Frankl eventually developed was a form of externalization. Okay, this I borrow from narrative therapy, this word called externalization. For here, it's a form of detachment. So when he's in a place where he's like witnessing great suffering or something that he found it hard to stomach, he would do this. He will externalize and try to project his own consciousness into the future. Suddenly, I saw myself standing on the platform of a well-lit, warm and pleasant lecture room. In front of me sat an attentive audience on comfortable upholstered seats. I was giving a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp. All that oppressed me at that moment became objective, seen and described from a remote viewpoint of science. Okay? Then further on, emotion, which is suffering, cease to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. So in this case, it also sort of made meaning of this suffering, which he was actually making a meaning of this piece of suffering that he's observing in front of his eyes. In the future, this will all be meaningful when I can use it as educational material for my own processing and also for my lecture room of students. So then the suffering doesn't become so unbearable. Okay, so this form of, I use the word externalization, detachment, distancing. Okay. So next up, you see this? Okay, so okay, I'm going to read this passage. Those of us who had any religious faith, I said frankly, could understand without difficulty. I told them of a comrade who, on his arrival in camp, had tried to make a pact with heaven that his suffering and death should save the human being he loved from a painful end. So this is the kind of philosophy that was holding him. Whenever, let's say, the SS guard hit him or deprive him of food or humiliate him, he thinks that, okay, I'm offering this suffering to God so that maybe my wife who's in the female camp can survive. So when he's suffering, it becomes a very meaningful suffering. So this way of thinking isn't actually very new. It originates, well, a lot of them are Jews, but it's also very popular in the Catholic culture that we can offer our suffering for the salvation of the ones we loved or for mankind in general. So that creates some meaning for suffering, and it ceases to become a pointless suffering. It be something that is good, like in exchange for the health or well-being of someone else that we love. So it's again Viktor Frankl trying to make meaning from possibly unbearable suffering, otherwise unbearable suffering, because now it's bearable. Okay, next up I'm going to read from page 112. Moreover, there are various masks and guises under which the existential vacuum appears. Sometimes the frustrated will to meaning is vicariously compensated for by a will to power, including the most primitive form of the will to power, which is the will to money. In other cases, the place of frustrated will to meaning is taken by the will to pleasure. That is why existential frustration often eventuates in sexual compensation. We can observe in such cases that the sexual libido becomes rampant in the existential vacuum. Okay, what he's saying here now is that if we do not have a clear meaning or purpose in life, and we're just traveling around aimlessly, pointlessly, with no idea of where we want to end up at the end of the day or what we have in store maybe in the afterlife, then we'll have a void, a vacuum, an existential vacuum, and it's easy to fill that up with power, with money, or with pleasure, and one of the most addictive form of pleasure, sex, which is actually what we are observing in modern society these days. So I think under logotherapy, what they believe is that if we can find time to sit down and really find what is the real purpose of my life, what's the meaning, that can actually prevent one from sliding down the slippery slope of chasing after power, after money, after pleasure, and more particularly after sex. Okay, next up. According to logotherapy, we can discover this meaning in life in 3 different ways. 1, by creating a work or doing a deed. 2, by experiencing something or encountering someone. 3, by the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. So that is actually the nutshell of logotherapy. So for him, what was driving him actually, maybe at the very initial stage when he first entered the camp, was he was about to finish his manuscript. In fact, he had it with him. And that was the last thing that he was willing to let go of, his manuscript. And his aim was I'm going to stay alive so that I can rewrite this manuscript when I get out of the concentration camp. So that gave him purpose. For other people, it was like, I want to go out. I know my son is alive. He didn't get shipped off to the camps. I'm going to find him. I'm going to be his father. I'm the only man in this world who will be a great father to him. I'm his biological dad. I'm going to make it out alive so that I can be his father. So that is enough to drive him. And the third one, by the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering, like what I mentioned previously, I'm going to offer this suffering up to God so that someone I love can live, can suffer less. So I'm suffering on her behalf. So when they have that kind of attitude, they can take on even the horrible sufferings in the camp. Okay. Okay, so page 135. A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. For example, in this living laboratory and on the testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swine while others behave like saints. Man has both potentialities within himself. Which one is actualized depends on decisions, but not on conditions. So he says that it's not the environment. You will suffer. Even if you are not in a concentration camp, just day-to-day living without a clear direction, you'll be suffering. So there will always be suffering. So it is your choice whether you want to behave like a swine or you behave like a saint. Even if you leave the concentration camp and you're out, there's still going to be suffering there. You're still going to take some time to adjust. And even after you have totally adjusted and dealt with all that trauma, there's still going to be suffering. So it's a day-to-day, moment-to-moment choice to choose to behave like a saint and not like a swine. And you can't do so if you have no clear meaning, no clear direction. So it's important to spend time to evaluate and find your direction. Okay, so there's a part about paradoxical intention. I found it. Okay, I'm just going to read this on page 128. It was the most severe case of stuttering he had ever come across in his many years of practice. Never in his life, as far as the stutterer could remember, had he been free from his speech trouble even for a moment, except once. This happened when he was 12 years old and had hooked a ride on a streetcar. When caught by the conductor, he thought that the only way to escape was to elicit his sympathy, so he tried to demonstrate it by being a poor stuttering boy. At the moment when he tried to stutter, he was unable to. Okay, so that is in essence what paradoxical intention is. It's the more you want to do something, the more difficult it is to do. So, for example, this is one. When you try to speak clearly, you end up stuttering. But when you want to stutter to elicit the sympathy of someone, in the end, you can't do it. And also, there's this man, one of the other patients, who has a problem with sweating. He got social anxiety. So the more he worries about sweating, the more he sweats. So the psychiatrist told him, just go out, and when you meet your girlfriend, your aim is to sweat 2 liters of sweat instead of 1.5 liter. Show them how much you can sweat. So he said, okay, that's my aim. Show them how much I can sweat. And for that day, strangely, he didn't sweat at all. So that's called paradoxical intention. Similarly, like if you cannot fall asleep at night, your aim is to stay awake on bed the whole night. So when you are doing that, it breaks off the tension, the fixation on that object, that desired action, and you might get it through this way. Okay, so that's all for today's video. So this book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, is a short book, but it's not easy to read because it's very emotional and there's a lot of injustice and inhumanities, especially in the first part. So you just take your time, read a few pages at a time, but it's definitely worth a read because it's written very easily, in a very easy to read way, and it's very meaningful. You definitely pick out a thing or two after reading this book. Okay, that's all for today's video. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for all the coughing and gagging. I'm sorry. I think I'm recovering from some upper respiratory tract infection. Okay, thank you so much. God bless. If you like this video, kindly press like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. God bless.